Welcome back to Midnight at WolfCloud Station. I'm your host, Sierra Sterling. Somewhere beyond mile marker 47, past the last gas station with its flickering sign, there's a kind of case that doesn't announce itself. No screaming headline, no manhunt, just two men, a hillside, and a silence that has now lasted longer than either of them got to live. Tonight we're leaving the highway behind entirely, crossing an ocean, in fact, to a stretch of Brazilian coastline where, in the last week of August, 1966, a mystery was laid out in the grass and left there, unsolved, for almost 60 years. This one doesn't come with gunshots or blood. It comes with a notebook, a countdown of sorts, and two lead masks, hammered flat and shaped to the curve of a human face, found resting over two sets of closed eyes on a hillside above a fishing bay. Stay with me. This is the lead masks case. Let's set the scene properly, because the geography matters here almost as much as the men themselves. Campos dos Goytacazes sits in the north of Rio de Janeiro state, a sugarcane town, unglamorous, a few hours by road from the capital. It's the kind of place where everyone more or less knows everyone, where a man's daily habits are common knowledge before he's finished forming them. In 1966, two of its residents worked as electronics technicians, a trade that, in that era, put a person on the edge of something new. Radios, televisions, the first stirrings of a more electronic world. It was a hands-on trade for men who liked to understand how things worked underneath their casings. Their names were Manoel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. Cruz was around 34, Viana a couple of years younger. What the surviving record tells us about them is thin, the kind of thinness that comes not from a lack of a life lived, but from a lack of anyone thinking at the time that their lives were worth writing down in detail. They weren't famous. They weren't wealthy. They were, by every account that survives, unremarkable men living unremarkable lives, right up until the last week of August, when they were. What we do know is this. Both men shared an interest that went beyond their day jobs. They were drawn to the fringe sciences of their moment: spiritism, parapsychology, the emerging language of UFO-contact that was spreading through popular pamphlets and amateur circles across Brazil in the mid-1960s. This was not, at the time, a fringe interest confined to a handful of eccentrics. Brazil in the 1960s had an active and organized spiritist culture, blended in places with an equally organized amateur ufology movement. Study groups, mimeographed newsletters, self-published theories about contact protocols, about the physiological risks of encountering something not of this world. Cruz and Viana, technicians by trade and believers by temperament, sat comfortably inside that world. Men who spent their working hours taking apart radios were, in their off hours, trying to take apart something much larger, the structure of reality itself, or whatever lay just beyond its edge. It's worth pausing here on the wider Brazil of 1966, because context shapes everything that follows. This was a country 2 years into military rule, a government that had seized power in 1964 and was steadily tightening its grip on public life, on the press, on what could and couldn't be printed. It was also a country swept up, like much of the world, in a decade obsessed with the sky, the space race overhead, satellites crossing the night, a global wave of UFO sightings reported from farms and highways and fishing villages alike. Brazil had its own well-documented flap of unexplained aerial sightings through the 1950s and 60s, some investigated by the Brazilian Air Force itself. Into that atmosphere, equal parts authoritarian control and public fascination with the unexplained, stepped two technicians from a sugarcane town, quietly building a private cosmology out of pamphlets, radio parts, and belief. On the afternoon of August 17th, 1966, the two men told their families a simple, plausible story. They were going out of town to buy electronic materials for their work, and some accounts add, to look at a used car. It was the kind of errand that raised no alarm. Men left home for parts and returned a day or two later with a bag of components and a story about the trip. There was no argument, no dramatic goodbye recorded in the surviving record. Just two men walking out the door, into an ordinary afternoon that would turn out to be their last. They traveled south and east, toward the coast, toward Niterói, a city that sits directly across Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro, close enough that on a clear day you can see the skyline of one from the shore of the other. And yet, in 1966, still very much its own world, connected to the capital only by ferry and by a long detour of road. Witnesses would later place the two men arriving in Niterói by bus at around 2:30 in the afternoon. It's a detail that seems almost too precise for a story this obscure, and it's precise because someone remembered them. Someone behind a counter, or on a corner, saw two men who didn't quite belong to the rhythm of the street that day, and held onto the memory long enough for it to reach an investigator's notebook weeks later. What those witnesses recalled selling them matters enormously to what comes next. 2 raincoats, practical, forgettable purchases in a city prone to sudden coastal weather, and a bottle of water, ordinary items, the kind of things you'd buy if you were planning to be outdoors for a while, exposed to the elements without easy access to shelter. Nothing about the purchases screamed danger. Nothing about 2 men buying raincoats and water in a coastal town should have ended in anything but an unremarkable evening. But there was something else witnesses noticed, something smaller, and in hindsight far more unsettling. One of the men accounts point to Viana was described as visibly nervous, checking his watch, again and again, as if timing mattered more than anything else about that afternoon, as if there was somewhere specific he needed to be and a specific moment by which he needed to be there. We now know, because of what was found days later, that there was a schedule, a precise one, written down, followed to the letter. From that point, the trail available to history goes dark. The last confirmed sighting of Manoel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana alive places them boarding transportation toward the Jurujuba district, a quiet fishing area on Niterói's edge, where the streets give way to hills, and the hills give way to something wilder. Somewhere beyond that last sighting, beyond the edge of the paved road, the 2 men climbed. We don't know if they spoke to each other on the way up. We don't know if either of them hesitated. What we know is that they were headed toward a specific hillside, a place, it would turn out, they had chosen deliberately and were following instructions to reach at a specific hour. Back in Campos dos Goytacazes, the ordinary machinery of worry began to turn. A day passed without word, then 2. Families in 1966 didn't have the tools we take for granted now. No phones in every pocket, no way to ping a location, no easy way to confirm that a loved one had simply been delayed. All they had was absence, and the growing, specific dread that comes when an ordinary errand stretches a day longer than it should. Somewhere on a hillside above Niterói, 2 men who had told their families they'd be back with car parts were already lying still in the grass, their faces covered in metal, waiting, if that's even the right word for it, to be found. Consider what those hours must have felt like from the inside, not the hillside itself, which we'll walk in full shortly, but the ordinary domestic waiting that was happening in parallel, miles away. A pot left on a stove a beat too long. A radio left on for company in an empty room. The particular quiet of a house built for 2 voices that suddenly has only one. Campos dos Goytacazes was small enough that an absence like this one would have been noticed by neighbors before it was ever formally reported. A car that didn't return to its usual spot. A workshop that stayed dark past its normal hours. None of that made it into any official record. It rarely does. The parts of a case that hurt the most are almost always the parts no report was ever written to capture. They would be found. 3 days after they left home, a boy chasing a kite across an open hillside would end that wait. But that's where we're headed next, not where we are now. Right now, somewhere beyond mile marker 47, 2 men are still climbing. And the file on what happened at the top of that hill is only just beginning to open. 3 days is not a long time. Not really. 3 days is a long weekend, a short vacation, the space between one Friday and the next Monday. But for a family in Campos dos Goytacazes, watching a doorway that 2 grown men should have already walked back through, 3 days had already started to feel like something else entirely. And on the hillside above Niterói's Jurujuba district, 3 days was exactly how long it took for the grass to grow just slightly around 2 bodies that had stopped moving. It was a boy, his name lost to most retellings, his role in the story permanent regardless, flying a kite on the open slope of Morro du Vintém, a steep, brush-covered hill overlooking the bay. Kites need open ground and a clear wind, and this hillside offered both, which is likely the only reason anyone climbed high enough, on August 20th, 1966, to see what was resting in the grass near the crest. 2 men, lying on their backs, side by side, close enough to have chosen the position together, or to have been placed there by someone who wanted them found that way. What that boy saw, and what he almost certainly did not have the vocabulary yet to process, set off a chain of adult intervention that would move, by the standards of the case, remarkably slowly. Word reached the local authorities. Officers made their way up the hillside and quickly discovered that this would not be a simple recovery. The terrain on Morro du Vintém was steep enough and overgrown enough that police required assistance from the fire brigade simply to bring the bodies back down to level ground. Before anyone could begin asking who these men were, the landscape itself was already making the case difficult. Let's walk through exactly what was found, because every detail here has been picked apart for decades, and every detail deserves to be stated plainly before the theories start piling on top of it. Both men were dressed formally, in suits, the kind of clothing you'd wear to something you considered significant, layered beneath the raincoats purchased just days earlier in Niterói. There were no visible wounds, no blood at the scene. No obvious signs of a struggle, no torn clothing, no defensive injuries, nothing that spoke, at first glance, of violence. And then there were the masks. 2 of them, one over each man's eyes, crudely fashioned from thin sheets of lead, soft metal, hand-shaped, molded roughly to the contour of a human face, and positioned like a blindfold rather than a covering for the whole head. Not manufactured, not store-bought, handmade deliberately by someone who understood how to work with metal well enough to press it into a functional shape. 2 electronics technicians would have known exactly how to do that. Nearby, investigators recovered an empty water bottle, the same kind, presumably, purchased in Niterói 3 days earlier, and a small packet containing 2 towels, both damp. Small, mundane objects that, on their own, would mean nothing. In context, next to 2 motionless bodies wearing metal blindfolds, they read like the leftover props of a ritual whose purpose no one at the scene could yet explain. But the object that would come to define this case, the one detail that has outlived every headline written about it since, was a small spiral notebook, found near the bodies, containing a short set of handwritten instructions. Translated roughly from the Portuguese, it read something close to this: 1630, be at the specified location. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals. Await signal, mask. Sit with that for a moment. It reads less like a diary entry and more like a checklist, a procedure, timed almost to the minute, written by someone who expected a specific sequence of events to unfold and wanted to be sure it happened correctly. Arrive by 4:30. Take something capsules, plural, never recovered or identified 2 hours later. Then protect the metals. Then wait for a signal. Then the mask. It is, in its own way, one of the most chilling documents ever recovered at a modern death scene, not because of what it explicitly says, but because of everything it implies and never explains. What were the capsules? Who or what was expected to send a signal? And why did 2 grown men believe, strongly enough to follow through, that lead sheeting pressed against their own eyes was a necessary part of the plan? News like this doesn't stay contained to a hillside for long. Within hours, word had spread through Jurujuba and the surrounding neighborhoods. A boy's kite, a police call, 2 bodies found in a place locals knew mostly for its view of the bay and its usefulness as a shortcut between neighborhoods. A crowd gathered at the base of the hill before officers had even finished the climb back down, the kind of crowd that forms not out of ghoulish curiosity alone, but out of the very human need to understand what has happened somewhere close to home. Rumor moved faster than fact, as it always does. By the time official word reached the papers, versions of the story were already circulating that had little to do with what investigators had actually cataloged at the scene. Talk of spacemen, of a landing, of silver-skinned visitors who had left 2 local men dead as some kind of toll for trespassing on their business. None of that appeared in the original police inventory. All of it, in one form or another, would go on to outlive the case itself. It's worth separating, even this early in the file, what investigators actually recovered from what popular imagination would later graft onto it. The lead masks were real, cataloged, photographed for the case file. The notebook was real, its contents transcribed into the official record. The raincoats, the water bottle, the towels, all real, all logged. What was not part of the physical evidence was any trace of a third party, any sign of a struggle, any indication that these men had been anything other than alone on that hillside when whatever happened to them happened. The mythology built itself, brick by brick, on top of a genuinely strange but entirely earthbound set of facts. And it's a pattern this case would repeat for the next 6 decades. Real evidence, sparse and stubbornly inconclusive, endlessly reinterpreted by a public hungry for a story with a cleaner shape than the truth was ever going to provide. Word of the discovery reached the press within days. Correio de Manha, one of Rio de Janeiro's most established newspapers, ran its first substantial coverage of the case on August 24, 1966, 4 days after the bodies were found. By the standards of the era's news cycle, that gap wasn't unusual, but it also meant the scene itself had already been picked over, processed, and in some sense mythologized by rumor before it ever reached print. Early coverage focused on the strangeness of the tableau. The masks, above all, proved irresistible to readers and editors alike. A death without visible violence is unsettling in its own way. A death staged, seemingly, with intention and preparation, is something else again. And then came the delay that would ultimately cost investigators the one thing they needed most: time. A formal autopsy was not conducted until roughly a week after the bodies were discovered, a week during which 2 corpses sat exposed to the heat and humidity of a Brazilian August, accelerating decomposition well past the point where Brazilian forensic medicine of the period could extract meaningful toxicology. No confirmed poison, no confirmed drug. No definitive marker of what, exactly, those unidentified capsules might have contained, or whether they contributed to the men's deaths at all. Investigators would be left, in the end, working almost entirely from the physical staging of the scene and the words in that notebook. Because the bodies themselves, by the time anyone with the right expertise examined them, had very little left to say. By early September, Correio de Manha was already reporting what would become a recurring theme throughout this case's official history: slow, faltering forensic progress, a case that seemed to generate more questions with every week that passed than answers. A change in the lead detective assigned to the file would follow within weeks. And somewhere in Campos dos Goytacazes, 2 families were left to reconcile the ordinary men who had walked out their doors for spare parts with the strange, staged, deliberate scene now being described in the newspapers. 2 men in suits and raincoats, lying in the grass, faces covered in metal, following a schedule that had run out precisely on time. By the first week of September, 1966, the file on Manoel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana had already become something investigators weren't quite equipped to handle. Not because the case was too violent or too complicated in the ordinary criminal sense. No rival, no motive, no obvious suspect ever surfaced. It was complicated because the evidence pointed, insistently, away from the kind of explanation a homicide detective is trained to pursue. There was no killer to find, according to everything at the scene. There was only a procedure the 2 men appeared to have designed and followed themselves, and a police force that now had to decide how seriously to take a death that looked, on paper, almost voluntary. Correio de Manha tracked the case's slow crawl through the system with a kind of dogged, weekly attention that has become, in hindsight, one of the most valuable things we have. September 3rd. Forensic work stalling, no cause of death yet confirmed. September 10th and 11th. A change in the lead detective, a case reassigned midstream, the kind of administrative reshuffling that so often, in cold cases the world over, marks the exact moment momentum is lost. Whatever urgency existed in the first days after the discovery was already softening into procedure, into paperwork, into a file passed from one desk to another. What we now know, largely thanks to that same newspaper record, is where the investigation's attention eventually settled. Detectives began looking closely at the world Cruz and Viana inhabited outside their day jobs, and what they found confirmed the direction the notebook had already suggested. Both men, it turned out, were part of a small, informal circle interested in what the era broadly called scientific spiritism, a blend of traditional spiritist belief, popular parapsychology, and the ufological theorizing that had taken hold across parts of Brazil throughout the 1950s and 60s. Materials consistent with mask-making and spiritist literature were reportedly found at their homes. This wasn't a passing curiosity. It was a serious, structured interest, one the men had apparently been developing together for some time, complete with its own internal logic about how contact with something beyond the ordinary world might be attempted, and what precautions such contact might require. That internal logic is, in the end, the closest thing this case has to an explanation. The working theory that emerged from the investigation, and the one that Brazilian police eventually committed to, formally, in their own words, was that Cruz and Viana had been attempting some kind of ritual experiment, likely intended to establish contact with a spiritual or extraterrestrial presence, and that the lead masks were meant to protect their eyes from an anticipated blinding light at the moment of contact. The capsules mentioned in the notebook, under this theory, were meant to be a preparatory step, perhaps intended to heighten perception, perhaps intended as a purely ceremonial gesture, perhaps a genuinely dangerous substance the two men underestimated. We simply don't know which, because by the time an autopsy was finally performed, roughly a week after the discovery, the tropical heat had already destroyed what toxicology might have told us. Brazilian forensic science in 1966 additionally lacked the trace-level testing capacity that might have salvaged an answer even from a fresher body. What could have been the case's single, most important piece of physical evidence simply never existed to be analyzed. On October 22, 1966, police formally announced their conclusion. The deaths, they stated, were the result of a failed experiment in the practice of parapsychology. 5 days later, the lead detective on the case went further in comments to the press, expressing his personal belief that the men had died attempting to communicate with the supernatural, a belief serious enough and official enough that on November 20th the case was forwarded to court accompanied by consultation from an actual parapsychology expert. Pause on that for a moment, because it's genuinely remarkable. A government investigative body, operating under a military regime not exactly known for indulging fringe belief systems, formally incorporated a paranormal contact framework into its legal reasoning about 2 deaths. That's not typical procedure. That's a case that had run out of ordinary explanations and reached, out of necessity, for the only framework the physical evidence seemed to support. But the best available theory is not the same thing as proof, and the case's official record reflects that tension for years afterward. On January 31st, 1967, the investigation was formally reopened, a signal that, whatever the October conclusion had settled on paper, doubts persisted somewhere in the system. By September of that year, Correo de Manha published a detailed chronological reconstruction attempting to pin down the men's exact movements during their final hours. The bus, the raincoats, the water, the walk toward Jurujuba, stitching together, essentially, the very timeline we've walked through in this episode. And then on November 29, 1967, prosecutors requested the case be dismissed for insufficient evidence. Not solved. Not officially closed with an answer. Simply insufficient. A phrase that in a case file functions less like a period and more like an ellipsis. Modern researchers who have gone back through this case with the benefit of hindsight, historians of Brazilian ufology, skeptic investigators, true crime writers working from the same thin newspaper trail we're working from tonight, tend to converge on a version of events that sits close to what the original detectives concluded, just with less mysticism and more plain human tragedy attached to it. Two men, genuinely devoted to a belief system that treated contact with the unknown as achievable through the right preparation, wrote themselves a procedure and carried it out exactly as written. Whatever the capsules were, a sedative, a folk remedy, something entirely improvised by amateurs experimenting far outside any medical safeguard. The working assumption among serious researchers is that this was less a suicide pact in the conventional sense and more a lethal miscalculation. Men who believed they were preparing for a transformative experience, who never intended to die, and who simply misjudged, catastrophically, whatever they had decided to ingest on a hillside with no one nearby to help if something went wrong. It's a theory that requires no aliens, no hired killers, no conspiracy, only two ordinary men, a genuine belief, and a fatal absence of caution. It also happens to be the theory the surviving evidence supports best, which is precisely why it has never been the version that spreads the furthest. It's worth naming the alternate theories here too, because no honest account of this case can pretend the parapsychology conclusion went unchallenged, then or since. Some researchers have long suspected the ritual staging was exactly that, staging, designed to disguise something far more conventional. A poisoning, a murder dressed up to look like a voluntary spiritual experiment gone wrong. That theory found unexpected, if deeply unreliable, support years later. On February 24, 1969, a newspaper report surfaced describing a confession from a prisoner, claiming the two men had in fact been murdered, killed for hire, according to his account, with the entire ritual scene arranged afterward to mislead investigators. It's a genuinely startling claim. It's also one that was never corroborated by any physical evidence, was never tied to a credible motive, a credible employer, or a credible chain of events, and has been treated by nearly every serious researcher since as one of this case's many dead ends rather than its resolution. Prisoners confessing to unsolved, sensationalized cases is, unfortunately, a pattern true crime audiences will recognize from dozens of other files. Attention, notoriety, sometimes simply the desperate need to matter, even from behind bars. And then there's the theory that has done more than any other to keep this case alive in popular imagination for nearly 60 years. That Cruz and Viana didn't just attempt contact with something beyond the ordinary world, that they succeeded, in some form, and paid for it. It's the version of this story that shows up in late-night forum threads and grainy documentary segments the world over. The version stripped of bureaucratic phrases like insufficient evidence, and replaced with something cleaner, stranger, more satisfying. It's not the version the surviving police record supports, but it's the version that has traveled the farthest, because a case this thin on facts, this rich in atmosphere, was always going to be filled in by whoever told it next. Here's the uncomfortable truth about this case, and about so many like it that we bring you here at WolfCloud Station. Most mysteries don't end. They just stop being actively investigated. There's a difference, a real one, between a case that gets solved and a case that simply runs out of momentum, out of resources, out of anyone left with the authority or the will to keep asking questions. The lead mask's case belongs firmly to the second category. It was never solved. It was, quietly, in November of 1967, requested for dismissal due to insufficient evidence, and then it simply sat. A file in a drawer, in a records room, in a city across the bay from where two families had already buried two men they never got a real answer for. That 1969 confession we told you about, the prisoner claiming Cruz and Viana had been murdered for hire, the whole ritual scene staged after the fact to mislead investigators, deserves one more moment of scrutiny before we let it go, because it illustrates something important about how unsolved cases actually behave over time. A story like that doesn't need to be true to do damage. It only needs to be printed. For a few weeks in early 1969, newspaper readers across Rio de Janeiro state had a new, cleaner narrative to hold on to: murder, motive, a hired hand, an ending that made sense in a way insufficient evidence never could. And then, just as quickly, that narrative evaporated too, unsupported by anything beyond one man's uncorroborated word. The case didn't gain a solution. It gained one more layer of noise, sitting on top of a scene that had already, by then, been picked apart by 3 years of speculation. What actually happened on that hillside remains, to this day, genuinely unknown. And it's worth being honest about what unknown means here, rather than reaching for false comfort in any direction. We don't know for certain what was in those capsules. We don't know whether Manoel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana believed, in their final hour, that they were about to succeed at something, or whether panic set in once the effects of whatever they'd taken began to arrive. We don't know if the signal they were waiting for ever came, in whatever form they expected it to take, before consciousness left them for good. We don't know if a third person was ever involved, however thin that possibility remains against the physical evidence. What we have is a notebook, 2 masks, and a documented pattern of belief thorough enough that 2 grown men built an entire evening's careful procedure around it, and then followed that procedure to its end. It's tempting, in cases like this, to reach for resolution the historical record simply doesn't offer. That temptation is exactly what has kept the lead masks case circulating for nearly 6 decades. Through Brazilian television specials on its 50th anniversary, through international documentary segments, through countless retellings that each, in their own way, tidy up the ambiguity just slightly more than the last one did. Some versions lean hard into the UFO framing, dropping the spiritist context almost entirely, turning 2 amateur believers into passive victims of something otherworldly. Other versions lean toward true crime convention, hunting for a killer the evidence was never built to support. Both versions are, in their way, more comfortable than the truth as we actually have it. 2 ordinary men, driven by a genuine and deeply held belief system, who designed their own ending and carried it out with a level of preparation that still unsettles anyone who reads that notebook entry 60 years later. Consider, for a moment, what happened to the families left behind because they rarely get more than a passing mention in retellings of this case, and that omission says something about how we consume stories like this one. 2 households in Campos dos Goytacazes spent the rest of their lives carrying a version of grief that most people are spared. Not just loss, but loss without an accompanying explanation solid enough to stand on. No trial to attend. No verdict to either accept or rage against. Just a police conclusion citing failed parapsychology, a newspaper report of an uncorroborated confession 2 years later, and then silence, stretching outward for decades, punctuated occasionally by a journalist or a researcher digging the file back out of storage to ask the same questions all over again. Grief without resolution behaves differently than grief with it. It doesn't get smaller with time so much as it gets quieter. Present, low, permanent, the way this case itself has remained present, low, and permanent in the corner of Brazil's cultural memory for going on 60 years now. Morro do Vintém still stands above Niterói today, still overlooking the same stretch of bay it did in August of 1966, and in the decades since, it has become something the 2 men who died there could never have anticipated. A landmark, of sorts, mentioned in local guides to Niterói's stranger histories, occasionally visited by the curious, permanently associated in the region's folklore with the story of the 2 men in lead masks. That's its own kind of afterlife, separate from justice, separate from resolution. The way a place can absorb a story so completely that the geography and the mystery become almost indistinguishable from each other. There's something particular about cases that resist closure this completely, cases where the how remains genuinely contested and the why is only ever partially recoverable. They don't fade the way solved cases do. A solved case gets filed away, in memory as much as in any record's room, because the human mind is good at letting go of questions once they've been answered. An unsolved case like this one keeps a low current running underneath it, permanently. A case that a podcast host on the other side of the world can still open, 60 years later, and feel the pull of the same unanswered questions that stumped detectives working the file in 1966. That's not a flaw in the story. That's the entire reason it's still being told. If there's a lesson in the lead masks case, beyond the specifics of 2 men, a hillside, and a notebook, it might be this: belief is not a small force. It doesn't require malice or manipulation or a villain standing somewhere off camera pulling strings. Two men can build a private cosmology out of pamphlets and radio parts and quiet evening conversations, convince themselves, sincerely, that they've found a genuine path toward something larger than an ordinary life in a sugarcane town. And that conviction alone, followed with enough precision, can be lethal all on its own. No aliens required. No hired killer required. Just belief, timing, and a hillside quiet enough that no one heard whatever happened in those final minutes before 4:30 became 6:30. And 6:30 became something neither man walked away from. The file on Manoel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana remains, technically, open, dismissed for insufficient evidence, never formally solved, sitting in an archive across the bay from the hillside where a boy once flew a kite into a story far larger than he could have understood. Somewhere in that same archive, preserved now in digital scans, anyone can search from anywhere in the world, sits the notebook, the instructions. The countdown two men wrote for themselves, and then followed, word for word, to an ending that has outlived every person who ever worked to explain it. And maybe that's the honest note to end on, before we close this file properly. Not every mystery resolves into a villain, a motive, a tidy final act. Some resolve, if that's even the word, into a fuller understanding of two ordinary men and the depth of what they were willing to risk for a belief they never got the chance to test twice. That's a harder story to sit with than a murder plot. It doesn't give you someone to be angry at. It only gives you two names, a date, a hillside, and the uncomfortable knowledge that conviction alone, without malice, without a single other person involved, can be enough to end a life. We may never know what those men believed they would find at the top of that hill. We only know they were certain enough to climb it, certain enough to time it to the minute, certain enough to cover their own eyes and wait. Somewhere beyond mile marker 47, that hillside is still there. The grass has grown back completely. The bay still glitters below it, same as it did in 1966. And somewhere in a records room in Rio de Janeiro, a file with their names on it is still, after all these years, open. If you have your own theories on what transpired, the station doors are always open. Explore our interactive case files, visual archival sketches, and official station apparel online at wolfcloudstation.com. Have a case tip, local anomaly, or listener experience you want featured on the air? Send your transmission directly to our inbox at midnight at wolfcloudstation.com. If tonight's transmission resonated with you, please subscribe to Midnight at WolfCloud Station on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you catch your late-night feeds. Leaving a rating and a review helps keep our signal burning bright through the dark. Keep the doors locked, keep the volume low, tonight's file is closed. This is Sierra Sterling, signing off from mile marker 47. Until our next broadcast, listen closely to the static.